Readers of the Libertarianism chapter are often either overly critical or undercritical. They'll either come to the table assuming that the conclusions of libertarian political philosophy are going to support their political sympathies, or they assume that they're going to run contrary to their political sympathies, and therefore they're either really, really harsh on the arguments, or they just give the arguments a free pass. However, as objective political philosophers and junior ethicists, we need to evaluate each argument on its own merits and not allow our biases to cause us to give bad arguments a free pass, or to be overly critical toward really negative or poor arguments. And so think about that as you read the chapter and as you consider the implications of libertarianism. If you think that the implications are going to be contrary to the way that you typically vote, or if they're going to be completely consistent with the way you typically vote, try to still analyze the arguments according to their own merits. Now, if you're a person who is generally uncomfortable with the conclusions of libertarian political philosophy, that doesn't mean that the theory doesn't provide some illuminating arguments and some twists and turns that can help us better understand the political landscape. The libertarian conception of original acquisition of property, building on Locke stuff about mixing your labor with the natural world, and then coming to have some superior claim to how that thing is used, makes quite a bit of sense. This is something that Nozick draws on in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He has something called enough and is good, or the proviso that enough and is good be left over for others, which doesn't necessarily obtain in contemporary times. But in any case, it sheds some light on how you might, or how a person might come to originally own something in a state of nature. It's also the case that the libertarian arguments shed a light on the importance of the fact that when people exert their energies, they sacrifice their time, when they risk their capital, this generates some sort of a deservingness to the fruits of their labor. The libertarian argument gives weight to that intuition that if we work for something, then we have some claim to it, which helps us to understand the resistance to taxation for various purposes. So again, even if you tend to think that the conclusions of libertarianism are not fully defensible for other reasons, still consider the arguments and consider them carefully because they have a lot to tell us. On the other hand, if you tend to support the conclusions of libertarianism, you think that it has quite a few things correct, don't worry that if we criticize or we point out flaws in the arguments for it, that we're somehow driven towards communism. That if we see that there's something wrong with the Wilt Chamberlain / Michael Jordan / LeBron James argument, for example, that this is going to mean that we have to embrace public ownership of the means of production, or some sort of a strict egalitarian society where everyone has the same amount of wealth and income regardless of their contribution to the economy. Or if we critique libertarians' resistance to the restrictions on the free exchanges between rational adults. They of course argue that if people want to engage in prostitution, if they want to use illicit drugs, if they want to sell illicit drugs, if they want to do many, many different things. In fact, the things that Sandel tells us there towards the end of the chapter, perhaps they might want to engage in consensual cannibalism. If a libertarian argument, a libertarian regime would push us in the direction of accepting those sorts of things, don't worry that if we consider those and they give us pause, and if we have some resistance to accepting those implications, that the alternative is that we have to go in some authoritarian dictatorship direction where there's no democratic input into the laws and regulations, there's no protections of individual citizen liberty. Perhaps we could strike a balance between the extremes. Perhaps not, but in any case, don't worry that if we critique those arguments and find problems with them, that it's going to necessarily drive us in the direction of full-blown Soviet-style communism in a very bad way. So there you go, common confusions with Sandel's Libertarianism chapter. Hope this has been helpful.